I'll be talking about my project entitled Surveying Machine Learning Techniques for Brain-to-Text Handwriting Communication with the Learning, Information, and Signal Processing Lab, formerly at BU, now at Dartmouth, with my advisor, adjunct professor Dr. Sang Qian. Essentially, my project is using machine learning techniques to understand the brain so that we can build better machine learning techniques to understand the brain even better. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. And the long and the short of it is, in order to, essentially, borrowing methods from machine learning in order to identify sort of patterns within neural activation systems within the motor cortex of the human brain. And the reason it's important to identify those patterns is because there's existing literature which my work hopes to expand on that essentially uses brain-computer interfacing to convert activity in the motor cortex from just raw data to the actual characters that are being written by the human hand as activity is being recorded, so that individuals with locked-in syndrome, for example, or full-body paralysis can communicate directly with the outside world without use of their hands. So the first thing that you sort of need to know about the approach that I used is essentially is that it comes from a theory within neuroscience. The idea of which being, if you
got this.
Sorry, I apologize. In which systems, neurons are best conceptualized in terms of systematic interactions with one another, rather than as individual neurons or as groups of neurons acting individually. So it's best to analyze them using sort of statistical techniques that look at their cross correlations and interactions with one another. So in order to do that, I used a data set recently published by Willett et al. That recorded the neural activity in the motor cortex of a man who had been paralyzed by a spinal injury in the middle of his life. So he had at one point learned how to write with his hands, but no longer had that ability. And the finding was that the motor cortex retains the pathways that represent handwriting in the brain to such an extent that when machine learning techniques were applied to the output of recordings of his brain as he was writing, the team was able to predict what character he was writing within an accuracy of 94%. Now, I was not able to get anywhere near that, but different progress was made. The Willett paper published a data set of 3,096 electrode recordings, each of which corresponds to a single written character, characters A through Z, and a couple of punctuation marks and spacing marks were evenly represented in that spread of data. And that is the data that I used to identify whether or not there are correlational patterns within the neuron activity that's recorded at that time. Because if there are, then we can apply new and novel machine learning techniques to those correlational patterns and push the boundary on accuracy and speed for classifying what letter is being represented by a particular snippet of neural information. So I was able to visualize and analyze this activation data set using a sort of unconventional technique borrowed from statistical machine learning, in which I took, there we go, we'll go straight to that, in which I visualized each snippet, right, each letter recording as a two-dimensional image where the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents each electrode in the intracortical recording that was device that was used to record this data. And I trained an image classifier on each of these graphical representations in order to there's the Z down there, that's interesting, in order to classify them by what letter is being written as that activity is being displayed. And the results were unmistakably, so these are images of the graphs themselves overlaid with a heat map of a technique that I ran after the training on the full model, which identified what parts of the input image were most important in accurately classifying characters. And what was found is, so the more yellow it gets, the more important, right, the area of the image is for classifying a particular snippet as A or B or C, etc. And so the unmistakable pattern is that in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a cluster of neurons which are most important for that classification. And upon further analysis, that's kind of hard to elucidate from these pictures, using a correlational analysis technique called a peristimulus time histogram, I was able to see that for each character, the neurons in that area, in that heat mapped area, displayed a sort of unique pattern of firing for each character. So what that proves is two things. Not only does this type of data have the systematic correlation behavior that we might assume that it has because of the theory of systems of graph neuroscience, but there are also identifiable patterns within that behavior that can partition an A to be different from a B, to be different from a C, and that can be used to make future iterations of machine learning techniques to do classification like this more robust and just pull out more data, so to speak. So that comes up to the second phase of this project, which was to, and there are 2 minutes for me to say all of this, which was to essentially design different deep learning models that, using this insight, can pull more information out of the data and more or less give the model more information to go on to do better classification. So one of those, I'll kind of speed up a little bit. The image classification that I did with those heat maps earlier gave a 78% classification accuracy. I tried reconfiguring them to emphasize time, reconfiguring them as a sequence of images where electrodes were clustered by their correlational period, and I got an 81%. And the future direction on this, which is currently being worked on, and I'm going to be handing this off to a team of students that I've collaborated with in the Academic College of Tel Aviv in Jerusalem. The future direction of this project is to develop a graph machine learning architecture that can basically understand from a peristimulus time histogram the relationships between the various neurons and between one another and the strengths of correlation between them, so that a graph neural network, which is a sort of on the cutting edge of current machine learning modeling, can be applied to this domain, and we can improve the accuracy and speed of classification. I suppose with that, I'd like to thank the team in Jerusalem that I've been able to collaborate with. And I'd like to thank Dr. Peter Chen, Dr. Elan Vadia, who's also part of the academic college, and Dr. Sorel Cohen, each of whom advised me in the neuroscience aspect and the machine learning aspect of this project, respectively. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and I'll open up for questions.
I have a clarifying question.
Absolutely.
Just to understand, because I find this fascinating. So what it would be is that you can read brain sensory imaging related to prior knowledge of writing abilities, and that will be able to give communication. So if someone still knew how to spell, they could communicate, essentially.
Essentially, it's more to do with the actual mechanics of writing. So in your motor cortex, there are pathways that correspond to, I pick up the pencil and I write an A. And what's found is that if you at any time learned how to write with your hand mechanically, those pathways persist in your neural cortex even in your motor cortex even after you've suffered an injury that causes you to be unable to write anymore. So those pathways, when they are activated, release or more or less exhibit a certain pattern that can be picked up on by this machine learning software that will tell you what letter is going on, what they're trying to write.
So it would be they're thinking about writing the letter A,
Exactly.
and then it would sense, or the machine would pick up that they're writing the letter A.
Exactly.
That's
It's
so
it's less so thinking about writing the letter A and more like like have you ever tried to move your arm and your arm was asleep and you couldn't move it but you were still trying to move it? It would be like that sort of sensation of like trying to move the limb even though you're paralyzed and you cannot move the limb. So that's the sort of stimulus from your brain that would cause a reading on this particular software.
So does this system only work for individuals? Do you have to, will you have to make it tailored to specific individuals, or can this be generalized to, is my way of writing an A the same way as your way of writing an A?
That's a really interesting limitation of this and something that I'm super interested in following up and learning more about. Unfortunately, there's only one guy that they've ever researched this on, so we don't know. But an indication that we would definitely need to be training it on multiple people, or there would need to be an individuation process, right? Is that when the initial training happened, they had to recalibrate the system every time there was a new learning period. So this, the original study happened over a period of 6 months, and every session they had to recalibrate it because this individual man's brain shifted so much in makeup that it was already hard to adjust for the changes that had been made. So if I had to assume, I would say probably calibrations would have to be made for every individual brain, seeing as so much difference occurred in just one example. But there's no telling for certain. The research hasn't been done.
Hey, I had a question about the specific models that you're using for training it. Because I've used like convolutional networks for images, and I was curious if you were using like a recurrent network for the time, I guess the sequence of images that you were talking about.
Yeah, the sequence of images actually is a convolutional. It's a recurrent. I've seen it both ways in literature, but a recurrent convolutional neural network. So essentially, you have, instead of a regular encoder in your recurrent neural network, you have a convolutional neural network as the encoder. So at each time step, you are doing convolutions on the data, and then you are taking it into account and doing the gated recurrent section based on the output of the convolutional neural network. So it's a mess, basically.
Well, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, and we will take a short transition before moving on to the next person.
Thank you for having me.